I never thought silence could hurt so much until it became the only language my family spoke to me. My name is Marta, and I'm 56 years old. I've lived long enough to know that some wounds don't come from words. They come from the absence of them. The fluorescent light in my kitchen buzzed overhead as I stood there, holding the phone against my ear, listening to my son David's voice grow colder with each passing second. "Mom, Clara thinks it would be best if you took some time away. To rest, to think about things." His words felt like ice water in my veins. Rest from what? Think about what? I'd been nothing but helpful since Richard, my husband, passed away 8 months ago. I'd tried to give them space, tried not to be the burden I could see forming behind Clara's perfectly practiced smiles. "David, I don't understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I thought we were doing fine. I thought—" "Clara's already made arrangements," he interrupted, and I could hear her voice in the background, sharp and decisive. "The lake house is available for the week. It'll be good for you to get away from everything here." Everything here. As if my presence in the home I'd shared with their father for 30 years had become something to escape from. As if I was the problem that needed solving. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. I set the phone down with trembling fingers and looked around the kitchen where I'd made countless meals, where I'd bandaged scraped knees, where I'd held my son close after nightmares and disappointments, the same kitchen where Clara now sat every morning, scrolling through her phone, her coffee cup leaving rings on the table I'd refinished with my own hands. She never looked up when I entered, never acknowledged the breakfast I'd prepare for David before he left for work. I'd become invisible in my own home, the lake house. Richard and I had bought it years ago as our dream retirement getaway. We'd planned to spend our golden years there, watching sunsets and reading books, and finally having time for all the conversations we'd postponed during the busy years of raising David and building careers. Now it felt like exile. I walked to the window and watched Clara's silver SUV pull into the driveway. Even from a distance, I could see the set of her shoulders, the way she gripped the steering wheel like she was preparing for battle. Everything about Clara was sharp edges and calculated movements. When David had first brought her home 3 years ago, I'd tried so hard to see what he saw in her. She was beautiful, certainly. Blonde hair always perfectly styled, clothes that spoke of money and good taste, a laugh that sounded like music when David was around. But her eyes never smiled when they looked at me. Never. "She's just different from what you're used to, Mom," David had said when I'd gently expressed my concerns. "Give her time. She'll warm up to you." 3 years later, I was still waiting for that warmth. Instead, I'd watched her slowly reshape my son's world, piece by piece, until I no longer recognized the boy who used to call me every day just to hear my voice. The boy who used to bring me flowers on Mother's Day, not because it was expected, but because he wanted to see me smile. Now our conversations felt scripted, careful, as if he was reading from lines she'd written for him. I heard the front door open and close with that particular firmness that meant Clara was in one of her moods. Her heels clicked across the hardwood floor, expensive heels that never showed wear, because she never walked anywhere that might scuff them. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for whatever important appointment awaited her afternoon. "Marta," she said, my name sounding foreign in her mouth, as if she were speaking a language she didn't quite understand. I hope David explained the situation. "I've packed a bag for you. Just essentials for a few days at the lake house." I stared at her, searching for some hint of the daughter-in-law I'd hoped she might become. Someone who would understand that grief doesn't follow schedules, that healing happens at its own pace, that sometimes a mother just needs to feel useful in the lives of the people she loves most. "Clara, I don't think I need— the fresh air will do you good," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Sometimes when we're grieving, we don't see how our sadness affects others. David's been worried about you, worried about me." The words should have brought comfort, evidence that my son still cared, still thought about my well-being. Instead, they felt like accusations, as if my grief was a choice I was making, a performance I was putting on to inconvenience them. I wanted to ask her when David had started worrying about me instead of with me. When had I become a problem to be managed instead of a mother to be loved? But the questions stuck in my throat, heavy and unspoken, because somewhere deep down, I was afraid of the answers. The suitcase sat by the front door, already packed with clothes I hadn't chosen, toiletries I hadn't gathered, books I hadn't selected. It felt like evidence of how little I mattered in decisions about my own life. She'd gone through my things, made choices about what I would need, decided how long this exile should last, all without asking me what I wanted or needed. I touched the handle of the suitcase, feeling its weight, feeling the weight of everything it represented. This wasn't about rest or healing or fresh air. This was about removal. This was about making space for a life that no longer included me. "David's already at work," Clara said, checking her watch with the impatience of someone with more important places to be. "I told him I'd drive you myself. We should leave soon. I have a lunch appointment at 2. Of course she did. Clara always had appointments, always had somewhere more important to be, always had reasons why conversations needed to be brief and efficient. I'd learned not to expect lingering conversations or moments of connection. With Clara, everything was scheduled, timed, measured against the value of whatever else demanded her attention. As I walked toward the car, carrying the suitcase she'd packed with my life reduced to a few days' worth of necessities, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me had gray hair that needed touching up, clothes that were comfortable rather than fashionable, and eyes that held too much sadness for someone who should have been looking forward to peaceful retirement years. I looked like someone who had lost her place in the world, someone who had become convenient to forget. But as I followed Clara to her pristine SUV, something flickered in my chest. Not hope exactly, but something quieter. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was just the beginning of a different chapter, one where I finally learned what I was truly made of. The drive to the lake house stretched ahead of us like a sentence I hadn't agreed to serve. Clara's fingers drummed against the steering wheel in perfect rhythm, a sound that somehow managed to fill the silence between us with more tension than actual conversation might have. Her phone sat in the cup holder, buzzing occasionally with messages that made her smile. The kind of smile I never saw when she looked at me. "You know, Marta," she said after 20 minutes of highway, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're about to deliver unwelcome truths disguised as helpful observations. "David mentioned you've been having trouble sleeping since Richard passed." I turned to look at her profile, searching for some hint of genuine concern beneath the perfectly applied makeup. "I haven't complained about sleeping," I said carefully. "I've been managing just fine." "Oh, I'm sure you think you have been." She glanced at me briefly, her eyes reflecting something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. "But David hears you moving around at night. He's worried about the effect it's having on his rest. He has such important presentations at work, and he needs to be sharp." There it was, the translation I'd been learning to decipher over 3 years of marriage between my son and this woman. My grief was inconvenient. My restless nights were disrupting her husband's sleep, which was disrupting her perfectly ordered world, which meant I needed to be managed like any other problem that threatened her domestic tranquility. "I didn't realize I was being loud," I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. How many nights had I lain awake, staring at the ceiling of the guest room I'd moved to after Richard died, trying not to make a sound? How many times had I tiptoed to the kitchen for warm milk, or stepped outside to the garden, desperate for air that didn't feel thick with my own sadness? "You're not loud, exactly," Clara continued, her voice taking on that patient quality teachers use with slow students. "It's more about energy, negative energy. The house just feels heavy when someone is carrying so much sadness around. David's noticed it too, though he's too sweet to say anything directly to you." Sweet. She called my son sweet, while describing how my presence had become a burden to him. I wanted to remind her that David had once been the child who crawled into my bed during thunderstorms, who brought me dandelions as if they were roses, who called me every day during his first year of college because he missed our conversations, but that David felt like someone from another lifetime now. The trees grew thicker as we drove deeper into the countryside, their October colors brilliant against the gray sky. I remembered the first time Richard and I had driven this route, how excited we'd been about our future refuge from city life. We'd planned to spend our retirement years here, hosting family gatherings, teaching grandchildren to fish, creating the kind of warm, chaotic household memories that become family legends. Now the thought of those empty rooms waiting for me felt like being buried alive. "Has David said anything else about me?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded, hating that I needed to know how far I'd fallen in my own son's estimation. Clara's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "He's just concerned that you haven't been moving forward with your life. It's been 8 months, Marta. At some point, grief becomes self-indulgence. Self-indulgence." The words hit me like a physical blow. Richard and I had been married for 32 years. We'd built a life together, raised a son together, planned to grow old together. 8 months wasn't even long enough for the seasons to complete their cycle. But apparently, it was long enough for my son's wife to decide I was wallowing. "I've been trying to help around the house," I said, my voice barely audible over the hum of the expensive car engine. "I thought maybe if I could be useful—" "That's part of the problem," Clara interrupted smoothly. "David feels guilty when you do things for us. Like you're trying to earn your place or something. It makes him uncomfortable. Earn my place. In the house where I'd raised him. In the family I'd helped create." I stared out the window at the passing landscape, wondering when love had become something that required justification, when being a mother had become a privilege that could be revoked rather than a bond that was supposed to endure. "What about Thanksgiving?" I asked suddenly, remembering the conversation David and I had started last week about holiday plans. "We were going to discuss whether to have it at the house or—" "Oh, we've decided to spend it with my family this year," Clara said, not even pretending to look apologetic. "My parents haven't seen David in ages, and they have that beautiful dining room that's perfect for entertaining. You understand?" I understood perfectly. I understood that I was being erased from my son's life one holiday at a time, one tradition at a time, one conversation at a time. Thanksgiving had always been my holiday. The one meal where I pulled out my mother's china and made the stuffing recipe that had been in our family for 3 generations. The one day when David used to tell anyone who would listen that nobody cooked turkey like his mom. "I could still contribute something," I offered weakly. "Maybe bring dessert or—" "Marta, you don't need to worry about any of that. My mother has everything planned already. Really, this time away will be good for you. Give you space to think about what you want to do next with your life. What I wanted to do next, with my life." As if grief came with an expiration date and a clear set of instructions for what came after. As if losing the person you'd shared your entire adult life with was something you recovered from, like a cold or a broken bone. We pulled into the gravel driveway of the lake house, and the familiar sight of the blue shutters and wraparound porch that Richard had built with his own hands made my chest tight. Every board, every nail, every carefully chosen detail represented dreams we'd shared and plans we'd made together. Now it felt like a mausoleum. Clara parked and immediately checked her phone, scrolling through messages with the focused attention she never gave to conversations with me. "I can't stay," she said without looking up. "Like I mentioned, I have that lunch appointment, but you have everything you need for a few days. There's some food in the refrigerator and the landline works if you need anything." A few days. She made it sound temporary, casual, as if this were a vacation I'd requested instead of an exile she'd arranged. I watched her pull my suitcase from the trunk with efficient movements, setting it on the porch like a delivery she needed to complete before moving on to more important tasks. "When should I expect David to pick me up?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Clara's pause lasted just a moment too long. "Oh, he's incredibly busy with the Morrison account this week. I'm sure he'll call when things settle down." She was already back in the driver's seat, engine running, her goodbye delivered through the partially open window like an afterthought. I stood on the porch, watching her silver SUV disappear down the tree-lined road, feeling more alone than I had even in the worst days after Richard's funeral. At least then, people had surrounded me with casseroles and sympathy and the assumption that I deserved comfort. Now, apparently, I deserved only the silence of empty rooms and the company of my own thoughts. I picked up the suitcase. Heavier than it should have been, though I couldn't imagine what Clara had deemed essential enough to pack for my indefinite stay. The key was where it had always been, under the painted rock Richard had made during a particularly creative weekend years ago. His handprint was still visible in the faded blue paint, a reminder of the man who had never made me feel like I needed to earn my place in his heart. Inside, the house felt different than it had during happier visits. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, as if the rooms themselves were waiting for something to happen. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, and I could hear the old wooden floors settling around me, familiar sounds that should have been comforting but somehow felt ominous instead. I was alone in the place Richard and I had built for our future, carrying a suitcase packed by a woman who saw me as an obstacle to her perfect life. And for the first time since my husband's death, I wasn't sure I had the strength to pretend everything was going to be all right. The first night at the lake house, I called David 3 times. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second rang twice before going silent. The third time, Clara answered his phone with a voice so sweet it could have been honey poured over broken glass. "Oh, hi, Marta. David's in the shower. But I'll tell him you called. He's been so exhausted lately. All this stress at work. You know how it is. I'm sure he'll call you back when things calm down a bit." But he didn't call back. Not that night, not the next morning, not even when I left a message saying I just wanted to hear his voice, that I missed him, that I hoped he was taking care of himself. The silence stretched between us like a chasm I couldn't figure out how to cross. By the third day, I stopped calling altogether. Instead, I found myself standing by the kitchen window, staring at the lake where Richard used to fish every morning during our visits here. He'd wake before sunrise, make coffee in the old percolator that took forever, but somehow made everything taste better, and disappear onto the dock with his tackle box and the morning paper. When I'd finally emerge an hour later, he'd wave from his chair like he was greeting the most beautiful sight in the world. Now the dock stood empty, and the silence felt heavy enough to drown in. I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning, organized cabinets that were already perfectly arranged, read the same page of a mystery novel over and over without absorbing a single word. But mostly, I found myself replaying conversations from the past few months, searching for clues I'd missed about how completely I'd become irrelevant in my own son's life. There had been David's birthday dinner in September. I'd spent days planning the menu, making his favorite chocolate cake from scratch the way I'd done every year since he turned 5. When I'd called to confirm the time, Clara had answered with that particular sigh that meant I was interrupting something important. "Oh, Marta, didn't David tell you? We ended up making reservations at that new French place downtown. You know how David loves trying new restaurants, and I thought it would be nice for him to have something special for once." Something special. As if 3 decades of homemade birthday cakes hadn't been special enough. As if the tradition we'd built together had become quaint and outdated. Something to be replaced with better options. "I could still bring the cake," I'd offered, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "Maybe for dessert, or we could have it later. The restaurant has this amazing pastry chef," Clara had interrupted smoothly. "David's really excited to try their chocolate soufflé. But thank you for thinking of him. Thank you for thinking of him." As if thinking of my own son was a courtesy I provided, rather than a natural instinct I couldn't turn off if I tried. As if 30 years of birthday cakes could be dismissed with polite appreciation for my effort. I'd hung up the phone and stared at the cake I'd already baked, its chocolate layers perfect and moist, the frosting decorated with the little sugar flowers I'd learned to make when David was small and thought his mother could do magic. I'd eaten 1 slice standing at the kitchen counter, and then wrapped the rest for the neighbors, who thanked me profusely and asked why I wasn't celebrating with David. I'd smiled and said something vague about change of plans, but the truth was I hadn't been invited to celebrate with my own son. I'd become an afterthought to his birthday, a tradition that was easier to replace than to include. That same pattern had repeated itself throughout the fall. The dinner party where Clara had mentioned they were hosting David's colleagues and their wives, but somehow forgot to tell me until the morning of, when she called to ask if I could watch their friend's dog for the evening because it would be awkward to have too many people in the house. The weekend trip to her parents' lake house, different from ours, better according to Clara, where David had apparently needed to unwind from work stress, but somehow forgot to mention it until I saw the photos on social media. In every photo, David looked happy, relaxed, like someone who had successfully eliminated whatever was causing him stress. The message was clear. His life was better without me in it. The worst part wasn't even the exclusion itself. It was the way it was presented as kindness. Clara had a gift for making my removal from situations sound like consideration for my feelings. "We thought you might be more comfortable staying home. We didn't want to overwhelm you with too many people. We figured you'd prefer to have a quiet evening." She never asked what I'd prefer. She decided what I'd prefer, announced it as fact, and somehow made me feel grateful for being protected from experiences I'd actually wanted to have. On the fourth morning at the lake house, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in months. The woman staring back at me had hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too large for her face. When had I gotten so thin? When had my hair become so gray? When had I started to look like someone who was disappearing? I tried to remember the last time someone had looked at me and really seen me, not as a problem to be managed or a burden to be accommodated, but as a person worthy of attention and care. Richard had been gone 8 months. Before that, he'd been sick for 6 months, and I'd been so focused on caring for him that I'd stopped thinking about myself as anything other than a caregiver. When was the last time I'd bought new clothes? When was the last time I'd made plans that weren't centered around someone else's needs? When was the last time I'd felt like I mattered for something other than what I could do for other people? The phone rang while I was making coffee. The old rotary phone Richard had insisted on keeping because he liked the sound it made. For a moment, my heart leaped. David, finally. But the voice on the other end belonged to Sarah, my next-door neighbor from home. "Marta, honey, I hope you don't mind me calling. Clara gave me this number. She mentioned you were taking some time away, and I wanted to check on you." Even Sarah's concern felt filtered through Clara's narrative. Taking some time away, as if this exile had been my idea, my choice, my need for space rather than theirs. "I'm doing fine," I said automatically, the response I'd trained myself to give whenever anyone asked about my well-being. "Just enjoying the quiet. Well, I wanted you to know that the book club is reading that mystery series you recommended, and we keep wishing you were here to discuss it with us. Margaret especially misses your insights. You always catch details the rest of us miss." Book club. I'd forgotten that was starting this month. Another weekly routine I'd been looking forward to. Another small piece of normal life I'd been removed from without consultation. I wondered if Clara had told them I wasn't interested anymore, or if she'd simply let them assume I'd chosen to withdraw from activities I'd once enjoyed. "Maybe when I get back," I said, though I was starting to realize I had no clear idea when that would be. "Of course, dear. And Marta, if you need anything at all, you just call. We all care about you, and we want you to know you're not alone." But I was alone. More alone than I'd ever been in my life, sitting in a house full of memories of a marriage that had ended and dreams that would never be fulfilled, with a son who seemed to have decided that loving me was more trouble than it was worth. After I hung up, I walked out to the dock where Richard used to sit. The October air was crisp, the kind of weather that usually made me feel energetic and hopeful. Instead, I felt transparent, as if I were fading away one day at a time until eventually, no one would even notice I'd gone. I sat in Richard's old chair and tried to imagine what he would say if he could see me now. He'd always been the one who reminded me of my worth when I forgot it myself. He'd always been the one who made me feel seen and valued and necessary. Without him, I'd apparently forgotten how to exist as anything other than an inconvenience. The lake stretched out before me, dark and still, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. And for the first time since arriving at this place that was supposed to be refuge, I wondered if disappearing entirely might actually be easier than fighting to remain visible in a world that had clearly decided it was better off without me. By the 7th day, I had stopped expecting David to call. I had stopped checking the phone every few minutes, stopped rehearsing what I would say when he finally reached out, stopped making excuses for why a son might forget his mother was waiting to hear from him. The silence had become my new normal, as familiar as breathing and twice as painful. I found myself moving through the lake house like a ghost haunting her own life. I made meals I barely ate, washed dishes that were already clean, folded and refolded the few clothes Clara had deemed necessary for my stay. The routine kept my hands busy, but it couldn't quiet the voice in my head that kept asking the same impossible questions. When had I become so easy to forget? When had my love become such a burden that my own son needed to be protected from it? The worst part was how thoroughly I'd been erased, not just from events and conversations, but from the very narrative of their lives. When Clara talked about David's stress, I was the problem he needed relief from. When she mentioned his happiness, it was measured by my absence rather than any presence that brought him joy. I had become the negative space in their story, the thing that made everything better by not being there. On Thursday afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I drove to David's office. Not to cause a scene or demand explanations, but simply to see my son's face, to remind myself that he was real and not just a memory I'd been carrying around like a photograph that had faded beyond recognition. The building was all glass and steel, designed to impress visitors with its modernity and success. The lobby sparkled with marble floors and expensive art, the kind of environment where Clara would feel perfectly at home, but that made me conscious of my worn cardigan and practical shoes. The receptionist smiled at me with professional courtesy, but her eyes held the subtle wariness reserved for people who clearly didn't belong in such polished surroundings. "I'm here to see David Morrison," I said, my voice sounding smaller in the vast space than I'd intended. "I'm his mother." The young woman's expression shifted slightly, not unkind but puzzled, as if she were trying to reconcile the confident professional she knew with having a mother who looked like me. "Let me check if he's available," she said, reaching for her phone with manicured fingers that had never scrubbed floors or changed diapers, or held a fevered child through the night. I watched her speak quietly into the phone, her voice too low for me to hear the words, but her expression telling me everything I needed to know. When she hung up, her smile had become more careful, more distant. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morrison, but David is in meetings all afternoon. He asked me to let you know he'll call you later when things calm down." Later when things calm down. The same phrase Clara had used a week ago, the same excuse that had stretched from hours into days into a silence that felt permanent. I nodded and thanked the receptionist, because what else could I do? Demand to see my own son? Insist that a mother's presence should matter more than whatever meeting was keeping him busy? Make a scene that would only confirm every negative thing Clara had probably said about my emotional instability? Instead, I walked back to my car with as much dignity as I could manage, past business people in expensive suits who moved with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they belonged in the world. In the parking garage, I sat behind the wheel for 20 minutes, staring at the concrete walls and wondering if this was what dying felt like. Not the dramatic collapse of movie deaths, but the slow fade of becoming irrelevant until you simply stopped existing. That evening, the phone finally rang. My heart jumped before I could stop it, hope flickering to life despite everything. But the voice that greeted me wasn't David's. "Marta? It's Clara. I hope you're enjoying your time at the lake house." Enjoying. The word sat between us like a stone. "It's been quiet," I said carefully. Good. Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. David and I have been talking, and we think it might be best if you started looking into some more permanent housing arrangements. You know, something that would give you more independence." The words hit me like cold water. Permanent housing arrangements. Independence. The careful language of people who wanted to sound caring while delivering devastating news. "I don't understand," I whispered. "The house? Our house? That's my home." "Well, that's just it," Clara continued, her voice taking on that patient tone again. "It's been hard for David, living in the same space where his father died. All those memories, you know? And with your grief, it's just not healthy for anyone. We've been looking at some lovely senior communities, places where you'd have your own space, but also activities and people your own age." Senior communities. She was talking about moving me to a nursing home, at 56, because my grief was inconvenient and my presence was unhealthy for her husband. "Clara, I'm not ready for—" "Of course you're not ready," she interrupted smoothly. Change is always difficult. But sometimes we have to make decisions based on what's best for everyone involved, not just what feels comfortable. What's best for everyone involved. Everyone except me, apparently. Everyone except the woman who had raised David, who had loved him before Clara ever knew he existed, who had earned her place in that house through 30 years of marriage and sacrifice and dedication. When? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Well, there's no rush, Clara said, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. Take your time at the lake house to think about what you'd like. I've already started gathering some brochures for places with good reputations. I'll drop them by when you get back. When you get back. As if my return home was still guaranteed, still something to look forward to rather than a temporary reprieve before the next exile. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen where Richard and I had planned our retirement dreams, where we'd talked about growing old together, where we'd imagined holidays with grandchildren and quiet mornings reading newspapers, and the simple contentment of having survived long enough to enjoy the life we'd built. None of those dreams had included senior communities or independence that felt like abandonment or daughters-in-law who measured love by convenience and found mine lacking. I walked through the house, touching surfaces Richard had sanded, walls he'd painted, fixtures he'd installed with his own hands because he wanted everything to be perfect for our golden years. Every corner held evidence of the future we'd planned together, the life we'd thought we were building for keeps. Now it felt like a museum of dreams that had died with him, artifacts of a life I'd been foolish enough to think was permanent. In the bedroom, I opened the suitcase Clara had packed for me, really looking at its contents for the first time. She'd chosen my oldest clothes, my most worn shoes, my plainest undergarments. Nothing pretty, nothing that might make me feel attractive or confident. She'd packed me like someone who was never meant to return to a life worth dressing for. At the bottom of the suitcase, wrapped in a towel like something that needed protection, I found something that made my breath catch. The jewelry box Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were the diamond earrings he'd saved for months to buy, the necklace he'd given me when David graduated college, the watch he'd presented on our 25th anniversary with an inscription that read, "To my forever love." Asked, why had Clara packed these? She'd taken nothing else of sentimental value, nothing that spoke to the life Richard and I had shared. Why include the one thing that would remind me most powerfully of what I'd lost? Unless she wanted me to remember. Unless the jewelry wasn't meant as comfort but as emphasis. A reminder of how completely alone I was now. How thoroughly I'd been separated from everything that had once made me feel valuable and loved. I held the jewelry box in my hands, feeling its familiar weight, and for the first time since Richard's death, I cried the kind of tears that come from the deepest places of loss. Not just for my husband, but for my son, for my home, for the future I'd thought was secure, for the woman I'd been before grief and loneliness had made me so easy to discard. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the remains of dreams that would never be fulfilled, something began to shift inside me. The tears kept coming, but underneath them, something harder was taking shape. Something that whispered that maybe, just maybe, I still had something left that they'd forgotten about. Something they couldn't take away or dismiss or pack into a suitcase like clothes that had outlived their usefulness. I still had the truth, and tomorrow I was going to start figuring out what to do with it. I woke the next morning with something I hadn't felt in months. Clarity. Not the desperate, grasping kind that comes from trying to fix what's broken, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from finally seeing what's really there. The sun was streaming through the bedroom windows, and for the first time since arriving at the lake house, I didn't feel like I was drowning in silence. I made coffee in Richard's old percolator, taking my time with each step the way he used to. While it brewed, I sat at the kitchen table and really looked at the jewelry box I'd cried over the night before. In the morning light, it didn't look like a painful reminder. It looked like evidence. Evidence of a woman who had been loved completely, who had built something beautiful with someone who valued her, who had lived a life worth celebrating before Clara decided it was worth erasing. Richard had chosen each piece of jewelry carefully, saving money and planning surprises, thinking about what would make me smile. The earrings had come with a note that said, "For the most beautiful woman in any room." The necklace had arrived on a Tuesday for no reason, except that he'd passed a jewelry store window and thought of me. The watch bore an inscription that proved I'd once been someone's forever love. Clara could pack my oldest clothes and arrange my exile and convince my son that I was a burden, but she couldn't change the fact that I'd been treasured by a good man for over 3 decades. She couldn't rewrite the history of who I'd been before grief made me vulnerable to her manipulations. I spent that morning doing something I hadn't done since Richard's death. I looked through the photo albums I'd brought with me. Not the way I'd been looking at pictures lately, with that desperate sadness that made everything hurt, but with the eyes of someone gathering evidence for a case I was finally ready to build. Here was David at 5. Gap-toothed and grinning in my lap while I read him bedtime stories. Here he was at 12, rolling his eyes at my insistence on taking pictures before his first middle school dance, but letting me fix his tie anyway. At 16, sullen and gangly, but still putting his arm around me for the family Christmas photo, because even teenage rebellion had its limits when it came to traditions that mattered. Here was David at 22. Walking across the graduation stage while Richard and I cheered loud enough to embarrass him. At 25, calling me from his first apartment to ask how to cook the pot roast I'd made for Sunday dinners throughout his childhood. At 28, bringing Clara home for the first time, nervous and excited, wanting his mother's approval for the woman he thought he loved. When had that boy, my boy who used to tell me everything, who used to save his biggest smiles for me, become a man who found my presence so burdensome that he needed to be protected from it? I studied the photos from David and Clara's wedding 3 years ago, looking for clues I'd missed at the time. There I was, in the mother of the groom dress I'd spent weeks choosing, standing beside David in the receiving line, hugging relatives and friends who told me how proud I must be. But even then, Clara's smile had been different when she looked at me versus when she looked at the camera. Even then, there'd been something calculating in her eyes, as if she were already measuring what needed to be moved or rearranged to create the life she wanted. I found the photo from last Christmas, the last holiday I'd been included in their plans. David looked happy, but there was something tired around his eyes, something strained in the way he held his shoulders. Clara stood beside him with perfect posture and a perfect smile, but her hand on his arm looked more possessive than affectionate. And there I was, off to one side slightly, as if I'd been positioned where I could be easily cropped out if necessary. For the first time, I wondered if David was as happy as Clara insisted he was. For the first time, I considered that maybe my son wasn't the willing architect of my exile, but another victim of Clara's need to control every aspect of their shared life. I spent the afternoon walking around the lake, really seeing the place Richard and I had loved instead of just surviving in it. The trees were magnificent in their October colors, the water clear enough to see fish swimming in the shallows, the air crisp with the promise of winter, but still warm enough to be pleasant. This was the peace Richard and I had dreamed of sharing. This was the refuge we'd built for ourselves when the world became too much. Clara could try to turn it into a prison, but she couldn't change what it actually was. A place where 2 people had loved each other completely, where they'd planned to grow old together, where every board and nail and carefully chosen detail represented hope for the future. As I walked, I found myself remembering conversations with Richard that I'd been too grief-stricken to think about clearly. How he'd worried about David's relationship with Clara. How he'd noticed the way she interrupted David when he tried to tell stories about his childhood. How she seemed to view my presence as competition rather than enhancement to their family. "She's afraid," Richard had said one evening after a particularly tense dinner where Clara had corrected David's account of a story from his college years. "She's afraid that if David remembers how much he loves you, he'll realize what's missing in his relationship with her." I'd dismissed his concern at the time, chalking it up to a father's natural protectiveness and a new daughter-in-law's nervousness about fitting into an established family dynamic. But what if Richard had seen something I'd been too optimistic to recognize? What if Clara's campaign to remove me from David's life wasn't just about convenience or space or my allegedly disruptive grief? What if it was about fear? That evening, I did something I hadn't done since the first day at the lake house. I called David directly, not to beg or plead or ask for explanations, but to test a theory that had been forming all day. He answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice as normal as possible. "I was just thinking about you and wanted to hear how you're doing." There was a pause, and in the background I could hear Clara's voice asking who was calling. I'm fine," David said, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. "How are you? Are you feeling better?" Feeling better, as if my grief were an illness to be cured rather than a natural response to losing the person I'd shared my life with. "I'm managing," I said carefully. "The lake house is peaceful. Remember how much your dad loved it here?" Another pause. "Yeah, he did. He always said it was his favorite place in the world. Yours too, when you were little," I reminded him gently. "You used to catch fireflies in mason jars and insist on sleeping on the porch even when it got cold." I heard something that might have been a small laugh. I remember that. "You'd bring me extra blankets and hot chocolate, and Dad would tell ghost stories that were just scary enough to be exciting, but not scary enough to give me nightmares." "He was good at that," I said, and for a moment, we were just a mother and son sharing a pleasant memory, instead of two people on opposite sides of whatever wall Clara had built between us. "Mom, David started. But then Clara's voice got louder in the background and his tone changed. "I should probably go. Clara's making dinner, and she's been working hard all day." Clara's been working hard all day. As if I hadn't spent 30 years making dinners for people I loved without needing special recognition for the effort. As if cooking for your family was some extraordinary sacrifice rather than one of the basic expressions of care that made a house feel like home. "Of course," I said. "Give her my regards." After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hands and tried to process what I'd heard in my son's voice. Beneath the careful politeness and the scripted responses, there'd been something else. Something that sounded like the boy who used to run to me when he was hurt, who used to save his best jokes for our car rides home from school, who used to hug me goodnight even when his friend said he was too old for such things. David was still in there somewhere, underneath whatever layers of guilt and manipulation Clara had used to convince him that loving his mother was a luxury he couldn't afford. That night, I made a decision that felt like the first real choice I'd made in months. I wasn't going to fight Clara with tears or pleas or desperate attempts to prove my worth. I wasn't going to make myself smaller to fit into whatever space she was willing to allow me. Instead, I was going to remember who I'd been before grief made me forget my own strength. I was going to honor the woman Richard had loved, the mother David had once run to when the world felt scary, the person who'd built a life worth defending before someone decided it was worth dismantling. I was going to stop asking for permission to exist in my own family's story. I was going to stop apologizing for taking up space that belonged to me by right of love and sacrifice and 3 decades of showing up when I was needed. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet, or what I was going to do about it. But for the first time since Richard's death, I felt like someone worth fighting for. And tomorrow, I was going to start figuring out how to do that fighting smart. The next morning, I woke up with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. I was going to take a walk, not the aimless wandering I'd been doing, but a deliberate exploration of something that had been nagging at the back of my mind since Clara had driven away that first day. The way she'd handled my suitcase, the way it had seemed heavier than necessary for a few days' worth of clothes, the way she'd been so insistent about leaving immediately, about not lingering to help me settle in. I'd been so overwhelmed by my own misery that I hadn't paid attention to the details that Richard would have noticed immediately. He'd always been observant about people's behavior, always caught the small inconsistencies that revealed larger truths. "Watch what people do when they think no one's looking," he used to say. "That's when you see who they really are." Clara had thought I was too grief-stricken to notice anything beyond my own pain. She'd been wrong. I pulled the suitcase out of the bedroom closet where I'd shoved it after that first night, when unpacking had felt like admitting this exile was real. In the morning light, with my newfound clarity, I examined it more carefully than I had when I'd been too shocked to think straight. The weight that had seemed odd wasn't just odd, it was wrong. I'd packed suitcases for trips with Richard hundreds of times. I knew what a week's worth of clothes should feel like, what toiletries and personal items should weigh. This suitcase was significantly heavier than it should have been, and now that I was really looking, I could see why. The main compartment was deeper than it appeared, with what looked like a false bottom that had been carefully constructed to hide something underneath the clothes Clara had selected for my stay. My hands were trembling as I felt around the edges, looking for a way to lift what I now realized wasn't actually the bottom of the case. When I found the small tab hidden in the corner and pulled, the false bottom came away to reveal a space I'd never known existed. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags and tissue paper like valuable artifacts being preserved for posterity, were documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements, insurance papers, real estate documents, all bearing Richard's name and mine, but showing transactions and accounts I knew nothing about. I sat on the bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of a financial life I'd apparently been living without knowing it. Bank accounts I'd never heard of, investment portfolios I'd never been told about, insurance policies with beneficiaries that had been changed without my knowledge or consent. Most shocking of all was the deed to our house, our home where I'd raised David, where Richard and I had planned to live out our retirement, with my name removed as co-owner. According to the date on the document, this change had been made 6 months ago, while Richard was dying and I was spending every waking moment caring for him. The signature looked like his, but something about it seemed wrong. The handwriting was shaky in a way that went beyond the tremor he'd developed during his illness. It was as if someone had guided his hand, helped him form letters when he was too weak or too medicated to know what he was signing. There were other papers, too. Medical records showing doctor visits I'd never known about, during times when I'd thought Richard was resting at home while I ran errands or went to work. Conversations with lawyers I'd never met about estate planning decisions I'd never been consulted on. A paper trail of a man making end-of-life arrangements that systematically excluded the wife who'd been taking care of him. But the most devastating discovery was a series of bank statements showing monthly deposits into an account Richard had apparently opened without telling me. Regular transfers of significant amounts from our joint savings, money I'd thought was being preserved for our future security, into an account that listed Clara Morrison as the sole beneficiary. Clara Morrison. She'd been planning this for longer than I'd imagined. She hadn't just decided recently that I was inconvenient. She'd been systematically arranging my financial destruction while I'd been focused on keeping my dying husband comfortable and pain-free. I spread the documents across the bedroom floor like pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to solve. The pattern was clear once I could see all the pieces together. While I'd been shopping for Richard's medications and cooking foods he could keep down and holding his hand through the worst nights of his illness, Clara had been positioning herself to inherit everything we'd built together. But how? How had she gained access to accounts that required both our signatures? How had she convinced Richard to make changes that would leave his wife of 32 years with nothing? How had she managed to forge documents or manipulate a dying man into signing away his wife's security? I thought about the times Clara had offered to help with Richard's care, the days when she'd insisted I take breaks and let her handle his medications or his doctor's appointments. I'd been grateful for her assistance, touched that my daughter-in-law was showing such concern for her father-in-law's well-being. I'd never suspected she might be using those opportunities to influence him when he was most vulnerable. The medical records showed visits to lawyers and financial advisors during times when Richard had been heavily medicated for pain, when his thinking had been clouded by drugs and illness. The signatures on the legal documents showed the progression of his deteriorating motor control, getting weaker and shakier with each successive paper he'd signed. She'd been patient, methodical. She'd waited until Richard was too sick to think clearly, too dependent on pain medication to make rational decisions, too focused on his own mortality to consider the long-term implications of what he was being asked to sign. And I'd made it easy for her by being exactly what a good wife was supposed to be, selflessly devoted to my husband's comfort, trusting in his ability to handle our financial affairs, grateful for any help that allowed me to focus on caregiving instead of paperwork. I found myself thinking about Richard's last weeks, searching my memory for signs I'd missed. The way he'd sometimes seemed confused about conversations I was sure we'd had. The way he'd occasionally asked me questions about our finances that suggested he wasn't clear about our arrangements. The way Clara had been present for so many of his appointments with lawyers and advisors, always ready with explanations about why these meetings were necessary and why they couldn't wait until he felt better. "He's worried about making sure everything is in order," she'd told me when I'd questioned why Richard needed to see yet another lawyer during his final month. "He wants to know you'll be taken care of after he's gone." These men understand estate planning in ways that give him peace of mind. Peace of mind. The irony was devastating. Richard had died believing he'd arranged for my security, while Clara had been systematically destroying it with his unknowing cooperation. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed I would remain the grieving, helpless widow she'd been conditioning me to become. She'd counted on my continued passivity, my willingness to accept whatever arrangements had been made without questioning their legitimacy or fighting for what was rightfully mine. She'd given me the evidence of her crimes, apparently confident that I was too broken to know what to do with it. I spent the rest of the morning organizing the documents by date and type, creating a timeline of Clara's deception that told a story of calculated manipulation spanning nearly 2 years. From the first mysterious bank account opened when Richard was still healthy enough to question strange financial decisions, to the final signatures obtained during his last week of life when he'd been barely conscious most of the time. She'd been planning my exile since before Richard's diagnosis. She'd been arranging my poverty while I'd been celebrating her marriage to my son. She'd been stealing my future while I'd been welcoming her into my family. By afternoon, I had enough evidence to destroy Clara's carefully constructed narrative about my need for independence and healing time. I had proof of fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and theft, on a scale that would guarantee serious legal consequences for anyone who'd participated in such systematic deception. But more importantly, I had something Clara had never expected me to find: the truth, the complete, documented, legally verifiable truth about what had really happened to my marriage, my home, and my financial security. As I sat there surrounded by evidence of the most profound betrayal I'd ever experienced, I felt something I hadn't felt since Richard's death: power. Not the desperate, grasping kind that comes from trying to force people to love you, but the quiet, unshakable kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and what you're going to do about it. Clara had been counting on my ignorance and passivity. She'd built her entire plan around the assumption that I would accept whatever story she told me about my circumstances. Tomorrow, she was going to learn just how wrong she'd been about the woman she'd tried so hard to destroy. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with all the documents spread before me, making copies on the old printer Richard had kept in his home office, organizing everything into neat folders with labels written in my careful handwriting: bank fraud, forgery, elder abuse, insurance fraud. Each folder grew thicker as I sorted through the evidence of Clara's systematic destruction of my life. By dawn, I had a complete case file that would make any prosecutor's job remarkably easy. But I wasn't ready to call the police yet. First, I needed to see Clara's face when she realized her perfect plan had come undone. I needed to watch her try to explain the unexplainable, to lie her way out of documented truth, to maintain her composure when the carefully constructed world she'd built on my husband's grave collapsed around her. More than that, I needed to give David a chance to see who he'd really married before the legal system took over and made everything about crime and punishment instead of family and betrayal. I called Clara at 9 o'clock, when I knew she'd be having her morning coffee and planning whatever shopping or lunch appointment filled her days, now that removing me from David's life had become her full-time occupation. "Marta," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of barely concealed irritation. "How are you feeling? I hope the time away is helping you process everything." Process everything. As if my husband's death and my son's abandonment were items on a to-do list that could be checked off once I'd devoted sufficient time to thinking about them properly. "Actually, Clara, I've been doing quite a bit of processing," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "I've discovered some things about Richard's final months that I think we need to discuss. In person." There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. "Oh? What kind of things?" "The kind that are better discussed face to face," I said. "I think you should drive out here this afternoon, alone." "Marta, I'm not sure what you think you've—" 2 o'clock, I interrupted firmly. "And Clara, bring your checkbook. You're going to need it. I hung up before she could respond, leaving her to spend the morning wondering exactly how much I knew and how much damage I was prepared to do with that knowledge. Let her stew in uncertainty for a few hours. Let her try to figure out how to spin whatever story she thought might still work on a woman she'd apparently underestimated completely. The hours before she arrived passed with agonizing slowness. I made lunch I couldn't eat, cleaned rooms that were already spotless, rehearsed conversations I might never have. But mostly, I sat with Richard's photograph, the one from our 25th anniversary where he was looking at me instead of the camera, his eyes full of the love that had sustained me through 3 decades of marriage. "I'm going to fix this," I whispered to his image. "I'm going to make sure she pays for what she did to you, to us, to our son." Because that was what hurt most, not just what Clara had done to me, but what she'd done to Richard in his final months. She'd taken advantage of a dying man's love for his family, manipulated his desire to provide for me into a weapon that destroyed everything he'd worked to build. She'd turned his generosity against him, used his trust to steal not just money but the legacy he'd wanted to leave for the people he loved. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard the familiar sound of Clara's silver SUV crunching up the gravel driveway. Through the window, I watched her sit in the car for a full minute, probably gathering herself for whatever performance she thought the situation required. When she finally emerged, her posture was perfect as always, but something in the set of her shoulders suggested she was prepared for battle. She knocked on the door like a guest instead of using the key I'd given her years ago when she'd first joined our family. That small detail told me everything I needed to know about how she viewed this conversation, not as family business, but as a negotiation between adversaries. "Hello, Marta," she said when I opened the door. "You sounded upset on the phone. I hope you're not having another one of your difficult days." Another one of your difficult days. Even now, facing whatever crisis she suspected was coming, she couldn't resist the subtle implication that my emotional state was the real problem requiring management. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let her pass. "We have quite a lot to discuss." She followed me to the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room as if she were looking for evidence of whatever had prompted my call. I'd put the documents away, but I'd left one folder on the table, thick enough to suggest extensive contents, but closed so she couldn't see what was inside. "Coffee?" I offered, as if this were a social visit instead of a reckoning. "That would be lovely," she said, settling into a chair with the careful grace of someone trying to project confidence they didn't feel. "Now, what's this about Richard's final months? I thought we'd been through all of that already." I poured coffee into 2 mugs, Richard's favorite for me, a plain white one for her, and sat across the table with the folder between us like evidence waiting to be presented to a jury. "Have we?" I asked quietly. "Because I've been finding all sorts of things Richard apparently forgot to mention to me before he died. Financial arrangements, legal documents, account changes, the kind of things a wife would normally be consulted about." Clara's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup, but her voice remained steady. "Richard was very thorough about his estate planning. He wanted to make sure everything was properly organized." "Oh, he was thorough," I agreed. "Remarkably thorough, considering how sick he was during the months when all these arrangements were being made." I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a bank statement showing the secret account with Clara's name as beneficiary. I placed it on the table between us, watching her face carefully as she realized what she was looking at. "This is interesting," I continued conversationally. "An account Richard opened without telling me, with regular transfers from our joint savings. Substantial transfers, made while he was undergoing chemotherapy and heavily medicated for pain." Clara's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. "Richard wanted to make sure David and I would be financially stable. He was concerned about our future." "How thoughtful of him," I said, pulling out another document. "And this insurance policy change, removing me as beneficiary and substituting you instead. When exactly did Richard decide that his wife of 32 years deserved nothing from the life insurance he'd been paying for all those decades?" "Marta, I think you're misunderstanding." "Am I?" I interrupted, spreading more documents across the table like cards in a game where I held all the winning hands. "Because here's the deed to our house, with my name mysteriously removed from ownership. And here are medical records showing doctor visits I knew nothing about, during times when you volunteered to take Richard to appointments while I stayed home to clean the house and cook meals for a man who was too sick to eat them. Clara was no longer even pretending to drink her coffee. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and I could see the calculation in her eyes as she tried to figure out which story might still work, which explanation might salvage whatever portion of her plan could still be saved. "And this," I said, pulling out the final group of documents with theatrical flourish, "is my personal favorite. A power of attorney document, signed during Richard's last week of life when he was barely conscious, giving you complete control over all financial decisions. Signed with handwriting that looks remarkably different from Richard's normal signature, almost as if someone helped guide his hand while he was too weak to know what he was doing. The silence stretched between us like a chasm that had finally opened wide enough to reveal the depths of deception that had been hidden beneath the surface of our family relationships. Clara sat perfectly still, but I could see her mind racing, searching for some explanation that might still allow her to walk away from this conversation with her life intact. "I don't know what you think you're implying," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "But Richard made all these decisions himself. I simply helped him ensure that his wishes were properly documented." "His wishes?" I laughed, and the sound was harsher than I'd intended. "Richard's wish was to take care of me, Clara. His wish was to make sure his wife would be secure after he was gone. His wish was to leave David a legacy he could be proud of, not the proceeds of elder abuse and fraud." The word fraud hung in the air between us like a sword about to fall. Clara's mask finally began to slip, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath the perfect exterior she'd maintained for so long. "You can't prove anything," she said, her voice losing its careful modulation. "Richard was sick. Confused. He made decisions you don't understand because you weren't capable of handling the complexities of estate planning." "Actually," I said, reaching for my phone, "I can prove everything. Every forged signature, every coerced document, every transfer made while my husband was too medicated to consent to having his wishes systematically destroyed." I held up the phone, showing her the number I'd already dialed but not yet called. "This is Detective Morrison from the County Fraud Division. Interesting coincidence, that name, don't you think? I've already spoken with him about the evidence I've collected. He's very interested in cases involving elder abuse and fraud, especially when the amounts involved are substantial enough to qualify as felony charges." Clara's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice rising to something close to panic. "David will never forgive you for destroying his marriage, for ruining his wife's reputation over money that doesn't even matter anymore." "Money that doesn't matter?" I stood up, placing my hands flat on the table, leaning toward her with 32 years of marriage and 8 months of grief giving weight to every word. "This isn't about money, Clara. This is about what you did to a dying man who trusted you. This is about how you used his love for his family to steal everything he'd worked his entire life to build. This is about justice for Richard, and for me, and for the son you've been systematically alienating from his own mother." I pressed the call button and waited for the detective to answer. When he did, I looked directly into Clara's eyes and said, "Detective Morrison? This is Marta Morrison. I'm ready to file those charges we discussed." The legal proceedings that followed moved with surprising swiftness. Detective Morrison proved to be as thorough as his name was coincidentally appropriate. And within a week, Clara found herself facing charges that carried potential prison sentences measured in years rather than months. The district attorney's office was particularly interested in the case because it represented exactly the kind of elder abuse that was becoming increasingly common: sophisticated financial manipulation of vulnerable seniors by people they trusted. But the real resolution came 3 weeks later, when David appeared at the lake house door, looking like he'd aged a decade in the time since I'd last seen him. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, his usually perfect appearance disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been sleeping poorly and eating worse. "Mom," he said, and the word came out like a sob he'd been holding back for weeks. I opened my arms without hesitation, and my son, my 40-year-old son who'd been convinced that loving his mother was a burden he couldn't afford, collapsed against me like the little boy who used to run to me when the world felt too big and scary to handle alone. We sat on the porch swing Richard had built during our first summer at the lake house. David's head on my shoulder while I stroked his hair the way I had when he was small and troubled by nightmares he couldn't explain. The October air was getting cooler, but the late afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and for the first time in months, I felt like we were exactly where we belonged. "I'm so sorry," David whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know what she was doing." I believed him. The evidence Detective Morrison had uncovered showed that Clara had been just as methodical about deceiving David as she had been about defrauding me. She'd convinced him that I was having emotional problems that required professional intervention, that my grief was unhealthy and potentially dangerous, that removing me from their daily lives was an act of kindness rather than cruelty. She'd shown him carefully selected moments of my sadness, framing my tears as evidence of instability rather than normal mourning. She'd interpreted my attempts to help around the house as desperate bids for attention rather than natural expressions of love and usefulness. She'd convinced him that every phone call I made was evidence of neediness. Every meal I cooked was manipulation. Every attempt to maintain our relationship was emotional blackmail. "She told me you were becoming dependent on us in unhealthy ways," David said, his voice muffled against my sweater. "She said the therapist she'd consulted recommended some time apart, so you could learn to cope with Dad's death independently. She made it sound like we were helping you by giving you space to heal. The therapist who didn't exist, consulting on a case that had never been presented to her." Another layer of Clara's deception, another professional opinion manufactured to support her campaign to isolate me from my son. "She showed me articles about complicated grief," David continued, "about how some people get stuck in mourning and can't move forward without intervention. She said you'd been calling her at work, asking for help with things you should be able to handle yourself. I thought about all the times I'd called David's office and been told he was in meetings, all the messages I'd left that had never been returned. Clara had probably been intercepting those calls, using them as evidence of my alleged emotional instability while ensuring that David never actually spoke to me directly. The worst part," David said, sitting up to look at me with eyes that held more pain than I'd ever seen in them, "is that I wanted to believe her. Life had been so hard after Dad died, and you were so sad, and I didn't know how to help you. When Clara said there were professionals who could do a better job of supporting you through grief than I could, it felt like relief. I felt guilty about feeling relieved, but I was tired of not knowing how to make things better for you." The honesty in his admission was devastating and healing at the same time. My son had been struggling too, overwhelmed by his own grief and his sense of responsibility for mine, vulnerable to anyone who offered simple solutions to complicated emotional problems. "Clara made everything seem so reasonable," he said. "The lake house for rest, the senior community for independence, even the changes to Dad's will. She explained it all as Dad's way of making sure everyone was taken care of appropriately." "What did she tell you about the financial arrangements?" I asked gently. David's face crumpled. "She said Dad had been worried about you making poor decisions with money while you were grieving. She said he'd asked her to help manage things until you were feeling more stable. She showed me documents that looked official, explanations that seemed to make sense. More forgeries, more manufactured evidence." Clara had been comprehensive in her deception, creating a complete alternate reality where every cruel action was actually an act of caring, where every theft was actually protection, where every lie was actually truth told for the greater good. "The house, Mom. Our house. She told me Dad had transferred it to us because he was worried about you being able to maintain it alone. She said you'd agreed to the arrangement but were having second thoughts because of your emotional state. Our house. The home where David had grown up, where Richard and I had built our life together, where I'd assumed I would live until I was too old to manage independently. Clara had stolen it not just from me, but from the legacy Richard had intended to leave for his son, a legacy that was supposed to include his mother's security and happiness. "When the police called me," David said, his voice breaking, "when they told me about the charges, about the evidence you'd found, I thought there had to be some mistake. I called Clara, and she started crying, saying you'd planted evidence to frame her because you were jealous of our marriage. She said your grief had made you paranoid and vindictive. Even facing criminal charges, Clara had continued to lie, to manipulate, to cast me as the villain in a story where I'd been the victim all along. But then, I saw the documents, David continued. The real ones, with the handwriting analysis and the medical records showing when Dad was too medicated to make rational decisions. And I remembered things. How Clara always volunteered to take Dad to appointments. How she was always present when he met with lawyers. How she seemed to know about financial arrangements before I did. I remembered the last conversation I had with Dad 2 days before he died. David said, tears streaming down his face. He was so weak, but he grabbed my hand and told me to take care of you, to make sure you knew how much he loved you, to never let anyone convince me that you were anything less than the best mother and wife a family could ask for. Richard's final words to his son, a message of love and protection that Clara had systematically worked to make David forget. He made me promise, David whispered. He made me promise to always remember that you were the strongest person he'd ever known, and that if anything ever happened to make me doubt that, I should look harder at who was doing the talking. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun begin to set over the lake where Richard used to fish, where he'd dreamed of spending peaceful retirement years with the woman he'd loved for over 3 decades. The water was still and dark, reflecting the autumn sky like a mirror that held all our memories of better times. What happens now? David asked finally. Now we rebuild, I said simply. The legal system will handle Clara, and will handle us. We'll remember what we meant to each other before someone convinced us we were burdens instead of blessings. We'll honor your father by living the kind of life he would have wanted for us, together, supporting each other, being the family he was so proud of. The criminal trial lasted 2 months. Clara's defense team tried to portray her as a well-meaning daughter-in-law who'd been trying to help an unstable widow, but the evidence was overwhelming, and her credibility was destroyed by the systematic nature of her deceptions. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison for elder abuse, fraud, and forgery, with an additional requirement to pay full restitution for everything she'd stolen. More importantly, every financial arrangement she'd coerced was reversed. The house was restored to my name, the insurance policies were corrected, the stolen savings were returned with interest. The legal system couldn't give me back the months of pain and isolation I'd endured, but it could ensure that Richard's actual wishes, his real legacy of love and security, were finally honored. David and I spent that Christmas at the lake house, cooking dinner together and talking about Richard in ways that celebrated his life instead of just mourning his death. We hung stockings by the fireplace he'd built with his own hands, and David told me stories about Clara's manipulation that helped me understand how thoroughly she'd worked to turn my son against me. But mostly, we just enjoyed being together again, mother and son, the family Richard had been so proud of, the relationship that had survived the worst kind of betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. On Christmas morning, as we sat by the tree drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the lake, David handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a locket I'd never seen before, delicate gold with an inscription that read, "To the strongest woman I know. Love always, Richard and David. Dad bought this for you before he got sick," David explained. He hid it in his desk at work, with a note saying it was for your next birthday. I found it when I was cleaning out his office. The inscription was his idea, but I added my name because it's true, Mom. You are the strongest person I know, and I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that. I opened the locket to find photos of the 2 men I'd loved most in my life, Richard on one side, young and handsome from our wedding day, and David on the other, gap-toothed and grinning from his 6th birthday. As I fastened the locket around my neck, I realized that Clara's greatest failure hadn't been getting caught or going to prison. It had been underestimating the power of love to survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. She'd tried to erase me from my own family's story, but she'd forgotten that some bonds are stronger than lies, some truths are more powerful than manipulation, and some love is simply too deep to be poisoned by anyone's jealousy or greed. I learned something important during those dark months when I thought I'd lost everything. Sometimes the most profound battles are fought in silence. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from refusing to let other people define your worth. And sometimes justice arrives not with drama or vengeance, but with the quiet satisfaction of truth finally being heard by the people who matter most. The lake house is mine now, legally and completely, and David visits every few weekends. We're planning to spend next summer here together, fulfilling some of the dreams Richard and I had made for our retirement years. Not exactly the way we'd imagined them, but filled with the same love and family connection that had always been the most important part of any dream we'd shared. Richard was right about so many things, but he was especially right about this. The people who truly love you will always find their way back to your side, no matter how far they've been led astray. And sometimes, the fight to get them back teaches you something beautiful about your own strength, something that no one can ever take away from you again.